The waitress cared for the girl as if she were her own, without imagining that the single father would fall in love. Rain tapped softly against the windows of the small roadside diner, blurring the neon sign that flickered in tired red letters. Ruth's Place. Inside, the smell of fresh coffee and warm cinnamon rolls drifted through the air as Ellie wiped the counter with slow, thoughtful strokes. She'd worked the late shift for 6 years now, serving truckers, night nurses, and the occasional lost soul, but none had ever struck her the way the tall, exhausted man had when he first walked in, clutching his little girl like she was the only thing tethering him to the earth. The child's name was Lily. She couldn't have been more than 4, with pale blonde hair that curled around her ears and wide hazel eyes that never seemed to settle on any one thing for long. Her father, Daniel, looked as though he'd forgotten how to sleep. His clothes were wrinkled, his jaw shadowed with stubble, but he thanked Ellie with a soft voice every time she brought them a refill or offered Lily an extra cookie. It was supposed to be temporary, just a few evenings when Daniel's work ran late, and he needed someone to watch Lily for an hour or two. But after the third night, when Ellie discovered Lily fast asleep in the booth and Daniel with his head bowed over his hands, she realized this wasn't simply a father who worked too hard. It was a man unraveling quietly, determined not to let anyone see. Ellie learned that Daniel had lost his wife 2 winters before. He didn't volunteer the details, but he didn't have to. The way he looked at Lily, the way he hesitated before stepping back into the rain, told her everything. He had built his life around that child, and the weight of it had nearly crushed him. She never planned to care so much. But some evenings, when Lily tugged at her apron to show her a scribbled drawing or Daniel's tired smile turned grateful, something inside Ellie stirred. Something she had thought long buried beneath the ache of her own losses. One Wednesday night, as a storm thundered overhead, the diner nearly empty, Daniel lingered at the counter long after closing. Lily slept curled beneath Ellie's old cardigan, breathing so softly that Ellie checked twice to be sure she was safe. "Thank you," Daniel said, voice rough. He cleared his throat, but the words snagged on something raw. "You don't know what it means. Having someone who sees her. Who cares?" Ellie folded her rag and set it aside. "She's easy to care for." He looked at her then, properly looked, and in the soft light she thought she saw the man he must have been before grief had hollowed out the center of him. "Do you ever feel," he began slowly, "like you're waiting for your life to start again? Like it ended, and you didn't notice at first?" Ellie's heart stuttered. She thought of the baby she'd lost so many years before, of the marriage that crumbled under the strain of it, of the way she'd come to this town intending only to pass through. But she'd never left. "All the time," she whispered. Their eyes held for a long moment, and though no one moved, something between them shifted, an invisible line gently redrawn. The following week, Lily brought Ellie a paper crown she'd made, insisting she wear it all evening. Daniel laughed when he saw her, the sound unguarded and bright, and for the first time Ellie realized she'd begun to look for that laugh each night. It wasn't a sudden thing. Love never announced itself with trumpets and bright banners. It arrived in small moments, a hand brushing another's when passing a plate, the quiet ease of shared silences, the relief of knowing someone else was there. Ellie didn't tell anyone how her heart began to quicken when Daniel entered the diner, or how she started waking each morning with a strange, frightened hope. She just kept doing what she'd always done, pouring coffee, wiping counters, listening to the rain. One evening, as the diner's neon sign flickered against the darkness, Daniel slipped into the corner booth with Lily, who was chattering about the fairy house she'd built in the backyard. Ellie brought them their usual, grilled cheese for Lily, black coffee for Daniel, and when she set the cup down, his hand brushed hers. Neither pulled away. Lily beamed up at them, oblivious, her small fingers smudged with glue and glitter. "Daddy says we can have a picnic on Saturday," she announced. "And you can come if you want." Ellie's breath caught. She looked at Daniel, whose face had turned a little pink, but he didn't look away this time. "We'd like that," he said softly. "If you're free." She nodded, unable to find her voice for a moment. But inside, something fluttered open, tentative and bright. After they left that night, the diner felt quieter than usual. Ellie stood at the window watching their car disappear down the wet road, her reflection pale in the glass. She touched her cheek where Daniel's hand had brushed it and felt, for the first time in years, as if she were stepping into something she hadn't dared imagine. The next morning, she found herself thinking about what she might bring to the picnic. She almost laughed aloud when she realized she was worried about impressing a 4-year-old and her weary, kind-eyed father. But beneath her nervousness was something gentler, a quiet certainty that life, no matter how long it slumbered, always had a way of waking up again. She spent that afternoon preparing sandwiches and washing strawberries, her hands moving with the same practiced care she'd always used to feed strangers. Only this time, she couldn't stop smiling at the thought that maybe she was no longer a stranger herself. When Saturday came, the sky was bright and full of promise. She tucked the picnic basket into her car and drove to the little park at the edge of town, her heart tapping an unsteady rhythm against her ribs. Daniel was already there, sitting cross-legged on a faded quilt while Lily chased a butterfly in the grass. When he saw Ellie approaching, he rose to meet her, and for a moment they simply stood there, neither sure what to say. Then Daniel reached for the basket she carried, their hands brushing again, and this time neither of them pretended it was accidental. She let him take the weight, her fingers lingering on the handle a heartbeat longer than necessary. "I hope you don't mind," she said, feeling uncharacteristically shy. "I made a few extra things. Lily mentioned she liked strawberries." "She hasn't stopped talking about you all week," he said, a small smile pulling at his tired mouth. "She even asked if you'd teach her how to make your cinnamon rolls." Ellie felt heat rise into her cheeks, but before she could answer, Lily came barreling across the grass, arms outstretched. "You came," she cried, flinging herself around Ellie's waist. "I saved a spot for you." Ellie bent to hug her, the child's small arms so earnest and warm that her throat went tight. She glanced up and saw Daniel watching them, something soft and searching in his gaze. They settled on the quilt, Lily between them, chattering as she unpacked the sandwiches and little paper cups. The park was nearly empty, only the breeze in the trees and the occasional hum of a passing car to remind them of the world beyond the grass and sunlight. It felt oddly like a beginning, though Ellie knew better than to name it. Names made things fragile, as if simply admitting hope out loud could shatter it. She passed Lily a sandwich and caught Daniel's hand steadying a cup of lemonade before it tipped. Their fingers met again. This time, neither looked away. They ate slowly, talking about small things. How Lily was obsessed with building fairy houses, how Daniel once tried to bake bread and ended up with something closer to a brick. Ellie found herself laughing more than she had in years. Each time she did, Daniel's eyes brightened, like he was memorizing the sound. When lunch was over, Lily dragged them to the edge of the playground. She insisted on showing Ellie how high she could climb. Daniel hovered nearby, torn between pride and worry, while Ellie offered encouragement with her heart in her throat each time Lily reached for the next rung. "She's fearless," Ellie said when Lily finally leapt down, landing with a triumphant squeal. Daniel exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. "She didn't used to be. After her mom, she wouldn't even leave her room." Ellie turned to him, unsure whether to speak, but he kept going, voice low and almost matter-of-fact. "It took months to get her to smile again. To get me to smile again." He glanced at Ellie, his eyes shadowed but steady. "Then we found this town. And this diner." Something in her chest pulled tight, as if she were standing on the edge of something too large to see clearly. "Some days I still feel like I'm waiting to wake up," he said, his voice nearly lost in the breeze. "But then there are days like this." She didn't know what to say, so she reached for his hand. He let her take it, and for a long moment they simply stood together, watching Lily twirl in the grass. When the afternoon began to fade, they packed up slowly, as if none of them quite wanted it to end. Lily chattered about making another picnic, about coming to the diner to help Ellie bake. Ellie closed the basket and looked at Daniel. The question hung between them, unspoken but insistent. What happens now? But he only smiled, a quiet, grateful thing that made her heart ache in the sweetest way. "I can drive you back," he said, lifting the basket. "I'd like that." The ride was silent at first, Lily dozing in the back seat, her cheek pressed against the window. Ellie watched the town slide past. Quiet streets, tidy houses, the old oak trees whose leaves had just begun to turn gold. She thought of all the evenings she'd stood behind the counter, watching headlights vanish into darkness, certain she would never again be anything but a passing face in other people's stories. And now here she was, her heart tangled up with a man and his little girl, daring to imagine something more. When they reached the diner, Daniel parked but didn't turn off the engine. The dash lights cast his face in soft blue shadows. "I don't know what this is," he said finally, his voice rough. "I just know, every time I think about tomorrow, you're there." Ellie looked down at her hands, at the place where his touch still lingered. She felt something steadying inside her, something that felt almost like trust. "I'm there too," she whispered. He reached across the console and brushed his fingers against her cheek. Just once, as if testing whether she was real. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Lily stirred in the back seat with a little sigh. They both turned to look at her, the small, bright thread binding them together in ways neither fully understood. And Ellie thought, maybe you don't have to name something to believe in it. Maybe sometimes it's enough to simply sit in the quiet and know you found someone who sees you, even in your unspoken, unfinished places. Daniel helped her carry the basket inside. The diner was closed, dark except for the glow of the exit sign. He set the basket on the counter and turned back, his eyes searching hers. "I should get her home," he said, though he made no move to leave. Ellie nodded, her heart thudding. Of course. But still they stood there, neither ready to step away. Daniel seemed to sense the same invisible tether holding them in place. For one fragile instant, all the things they had not said hovered between them, delicate as moth wings. The hum of the old refrigerator was the only sound. He looked as if he might speak, but then Lily's sleepy voice drifted through the hush. "Daddy, can Ellie come home with us?" Her innocence was a blade and a bomb, cutting through every hesitation. Daniel's breath left him in a shaky laugh. He looked at Ellie with a question so naked it made her chest ache. She didn't answer with words. Instead, she stepped forward and pressed her palm to his cheek. The stubble was coarse beneath her hand, warm and real, and when he closed his eyes against her touch, she knew, without any doubt, that they had already begun something neither of them could turn away from. He covered her hand with his own. In that quiet, the past no longer felt like a cage. Grief would never vanish. It was woven into the fabric of who they were. But here was something just as strong, a promise not of perfection, but of possibility. She drew back first, though her hand trailed against his until the last moment. "Take her home," she whispered. "She's had a long day." Daniel nodded, but before he could turn away, she rose on her toes and brushed her lips over his cheek. The gentlest kiss, no fanfare, no declarations. Just an acknowledgement of all they were still afraid to say out loud. When he left, she watched the taillights disappear into the night, her heart too full to contain. She locked the diner door behind her, pausing to press her palm flat against the cool glass. She had spent so many years thinking life had already given her everything it would, good and bad, and that the rest was only waiting. Now she realized there were still chapters left to be written. The next morning came bright and clean, as if the storm of the night before had scoured the world of its shadows. Ellie woke early, the echo of Daniel's touch still warm on her skin. She stood in her little kitchen, brewing coffee that tasted richer somehow, and wondered whether she should be afraid of how quickly this hope had taken root. But she wasn't. Not anymore. By noon, she was in the diner again, polishing glasses and humming under her breath. It felt like any other day, until the bell above the door jingled, and she turned to find Daniel standing there with Lily perched on his hip. She opened her mouth to greet them, but before she could speak, Lily wriggled free and dashed across the floor, flinging her arms around Ellie's waist. "Daddy says you're coming to dinner," she said, muffled against Ellie's apron. "I helped pick the flowers." Ellie's eyes flew to Daniel's. He stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets, looking as though he was bracing for her to say no. But she couldn't. Not when Lily's small arms were around her. Not when the quiet in Daniel's eyes had been replaced by something like hope. "Dinner sounds perfect," she said, her voice catching. The relief on Daniel's face was so palpable she almost laughed. He stepped forward and, without hesitation, pressed a kiss to her forehead. For a moment, it was only the two of them, standing in the place where everything had begun. Lily slipped her hand into Ellie's, tugging gently. "Come see the flowers," she urged. "They're pretty." Ellie glanced around the diner. The counters she'd wiped 1,000 times, the tables where she'd watched strangers drift in and out. She had always thought this place was her ending. But maybe it was her beginning. She turned back to Daniel and Lily, to the life waiting just beyond the threshold, and felt something open wide inside her, as if her heart were stretching to make room. Together, they stepped into the sunshine. The afternoon smelled of cut grass and warm pavement. Lily chattered all the way to the car, her small hand still looped through Ellie's. Daniel carried the basket from yesterday, as if it were a promise they'd agreed to keep. On the drive, Ellie didn't try to imagine what came next. It would be too easy to ruin it with worry or doubt. Instead, she focused on Lily's voice, on Daniel's quiet glances in the mirror, on the steady thrum of her own heartbeat. At Daniel's house, she paused on the porch. It was nothing grand, just a weathered door, a little pot of geraniums, a welcome mat faded by years of rain and sun. But it felt like the most extraordinary place she had ever stood. He unlocked the door and held it open for her, not as a guest, but as someone who belonged. She stepped over the threshold, and it felt like shedding an old skin she'd worn too long. Inside, the air smelled of something baking. Lily tugged her hand, already chattering about her bedroom, about the pictures she'd drawn. Daniel set the basket on the table and turned to her, his expression unguarded and beautifully human. "I don't know what happens next," he said, his voice soft but sure. "But I know I don't want to face it alone." Ellie felt her throat tighten, but she didn't look away. "Neither do I." Lily squealed and darted down the hallway, leaving them in the quiet. Daniel reached for her hand. She let him take it, feeling the truth of this moment settle deep in her chest. Maybe love didn't come in grand gestures or sweeping declarations. Maybe it was this simple: two people standing in the wreckage of what they'd lost, daring to believe they were worthy of something new. As the evening light streamed across the worn wooden floor, Ellie closed her eyes and breathed in the sweetness of it all. The warmth of his hand, the laughter in the next room, the fragile, miraculous certainty that she was finally home.